this might be the panel that many of you have been waiting for. The question that will be discussed is, could the Russian invasion of Ukraine have been prevented? And we have, again, a distinguished panel. I'm not including myself here. And we have one person who has not yet been presented to you, so it's my honor to present Andrey Kortunov, a graduate of Moscow State Institute of International Relations in MGIMO in 1979. He also worked and completed postgraduate studies at the Institute for U.S. and Canada Studies of the USSR Academy of Sciences. He has a PhD in history. He's completed internships in various Soviet embassies in London and Washington, and at the permanent delegation of the USSR to the United Nations. Besides the various positions he's held over time, since 2011, he's been the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. And so he's a person in the center of things with a lot of knowledge that he's bringing us directly from Moscow. What we're going to do and the way we're going to proceed is Anatol Lieven, in a very disciplined fashion, will talk for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a panel, and we'll run from Hanna to Andrey to Tom. Anatol.
Thank you so much. Discipline, yes. In these remarks, I'm going to wear my realist hat. Of course, I call myself an ethical realist, but then in the words of the lady I quoted yesterday, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? So please think of me as an ethical realist. Hans Morgenthau, the greatest of all realist thinkers, expressed the fundamental principle of international relations or action by states as interests expressed in terms of power, as my brother said. And intelligent realist practitioners have also made it a key point to understand the hierarchy of interests, both their own and equally importantly other people's, in terms of vital and secondary interests. One way of defining a vital interest is an interest for which a state will, in the last resort, go to war, will fight. Now, there's no need for me to explain why, for the Russian establishment, Ukraine is a vital interest, because my brother and others have done that extremely well already. We just have to accept what they tell us and have always told us, which is that it is, from their point of view. And it's no good, as you know, Tom said yesterday, and I've witnessed this myself on other occasions, Western diplomats telling them that it isn't really their vital interest. That does not work, believe me, with any other country, other people telling them what their vital interests are. And from that point of view, as soon as the West, in one way or another, or Ukrainian governments, essentially attempted to destroy the key Russian interest in Ukraine, conflict was going to be extremely likely. Now, could it in principle have been avoided? Yes. I mean, we heard that in the last session. Neutralization, some version of an Austrian state treaty, would have at least suspended the strategic threat to Russia and have ensured continued Russian control of the base at Sevastopol. Federalization, autonomy for certain key Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine would both have guaranteed the continuation of Russian language and culture in Ukraine, which we haven't really talked about much, but was a key feature, I think, of Russian, of well-based, by the way, Russian anxieties. And equally importantly, it would have given Russia indirectly an important say within Ukraine, which it could have used to block actions against Russia's interests and to maintain links to Russia. Now, after the Maidan revolution and America's role in that, and the policies immediately followed by the new government in Kiev, some degree of conflict was inevitable. But a question which is rarely asked in the West, but which I suspect that Putin and certainly other members of the Russian establishment have been asking pretty much, not ever since, but certainly for a good many years now, is why Russia did not launch a full-scale invasion in 2014 or 2015, rather than in 2022, by which time, as Merkel and Hollande have said, Ukraine had had the time to arm itself very heavily with Western support, retrain its army, purge its army of basically former Soviet elements, and very much also, and critically, consolidate itself as a national state. I mean, to put it bluntly, if Russia had invaded in 2014 or 2015, it would have won. I mean, if it had tried to capture Kiev, there would have been a bloodbath of civilians. But the chances of capturing the Russian-speaking areas of the country with relatively little violence were extremely high. And also, by the way, I mean, there was a pretty good casus belli in, the massacre of pro-Russian protesters in Odessa, who were basically chased into the trades union building, which was then set on fire. Many Russians have said to me the Americans wouldn't have hesitated for 5 minutes to go in if something like that had happened to them. So why not? And here I think that there are two elements involved. The first is the reason why Russia did not annex the eastern Donbass or recognize its independence in 2014 or 15. And the Minsk Agreement, the second Minsk Agreement of 2015, which provided for full autonomy of the Donbass within Ukraine. Now, there were many, many ambiguities about that agreement, but clearly the point, from Russia's point of view, was precisely to have an area within Ukraine that would allow Russia to exert influence, over the Ukrainian government and over Ukrainian politics. The crazy thing, as my brother has alluded to, is that this was combined with a totally contradictory and incompatible element, which was the annexation of Crimea. I mean, obviously, if you're going to pursue the first strategy of trying to influence Ukraine from within, then you wanted to keep Crimea within Ukraine, and also demand that as an autonomous area of Ukraine. But I can't really go into why that decision was made. In any case, Andrey, I'm sure, knows vastly more about it than I do. So there was this hope, and of course, precisely because that was the Russian strategy, was why the Ukrainian government and parliament never had the slightest intention of actually implementing the Minsk agreement. The essential first step, that of granting through the constitution, I mean, a post-dated, of course, Donbass autonomy was repeatedly rejected, which rendered Minsk sooner or later null and void. But the other reason why the delay in invasion, I think, goes back to the Russian blob and what can almost be called a subsidiary doctrine of the Russian blob, and certainly of Putin himself until pretty late, which goes back to the 1990s, or as Friedrich remarked over breakfast to me, in some ways back to Soviet policy as well. And that was to try to increase distance between America and Western Europe, meaning basically Germany and France. Now, this has been rendered by Poles and others in terms of some evil new Yalta, but that is a great exaggeration. It's more along the lines of what Medvedev was proposing when he was briefly president, of a sort of consensual European security order. And this was pursued because Putin has been blamed by hardliners in America, in Russia, for having trusted the Germans too much, because of his background in Germany and his particular relationship with Merkel. But I think it needs to be recognized that this was a belief held much more widely in the Russian elites. This, and it was this was not just some immediate tactical approach. This was a very long-term strategy looking, far into the future, this attempt to divide Western Europe. from the United States. Now, this hope was repeatedly and bitterly disappointed, a whole series of iterations. Europe's agreement to NATO expansion, the Kosovo War, and finally, of course, and most drastically, the European failure actually to side with Russia, even rhetorically, when it came to the Bush administration's abrogation of arms control agreements in which the Europeans themselves strongly believed. The partial or large-scale failure to defend the civic and linguistic rights of Russians in the Baltic states. And finally, of course, the European Association Agreement proposal to Ukraine in 2013. But on the other hand, there was always just enough to keep this hope alive. There was, of course, France and Germany voting against the invasion of Iraq in the UN Security Council. There was the French and German successful opposition to an immediate membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia in 2008, though they didn't, of course, veto it permanently. There was the Minsk agreement brokered by France and Germany. And then, though in a very different way, there was the Trump administration, which seemed to open up the possibility of a deepening cultural political split between America and Western Europe, by which, essentially without Russia having to do anything about it, Europe and America would drift apart. And several Russians have said to me that if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016 instead of Trump, the invasion would have occurred in 2018, not 2022, 4 years earlier. When did this completely break down and the decision on invasion? It seems to me that it really only finally ended, this approach, within a few days of the invasion itself. I mean, despite the fact that by 2020, US officials were saying to me that Minsk is dead, the Minsk agreement is completely dead. They didn't say anything about what it could be replaced by, which of course, since the Russians also knew it was dead, certainly gave Moscow the impression that all it could be replaced by, in America's view, was Ukrainian military victory sooner or later in the Donbass. Minsk was dead. The French and Germans had done nothing whatsoever to, even in terms of public rhetoric, push the Ukrainians into fulfilling their part of Minsk, which was the essential first step. By the way, I should say, of course, I cannot say whether Russia and the Donbass separatists would have taken the next steps that were necessary. We just can't say that. We don't know, obviously. But it seems to me that right up to a few days before the war, Putin was still hoping that France, in particular, not Germany after Merkel's departure and the new government, including Annalena Baerbock, but France, could be persuaded to propose a treaty of neutrality for Ukraine and to actually veto, in effect, future NATO membership. Would that have been enough? Well, who can say for sure? Obviously, not possible to say for sure. In my view, however, it would have been enough. And because not so much, I mean, it would have answered, from the point of view of one key NATO member, Russia's first demand, after which it would have been very difficult, I think, for Putin to justify an invasion. But also because, of course, it would have revived this whole dream or project of dividing Western Europe from America. And on the other hand, every person in the Russian establishment I've ever talked to was well aware that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine would lead to a complete breach with Western Europe and would drive the Western European countries right back fully into the arms of the United States. Now, I don't think that Putin expected the degree of West European support for Ukraine and the arming of Ukraine, but the awareness that this would, for the foreseeable future, end this hope of dividing the Europeans and the Americans, I think this was well understood. There were, of course, those who didn't care, but there were others who did care. So it seems to me that this ultimately was what decided Putin on invasion, the breakdown of that hope. And that in turn, well, it's a different subject, but reflects what Jeremy Shapiro and I can't remember her first name, Pugliadin, that's right, have called the vassalization of Europe, that essentially whatever Macron may fantasize about, but Europe is now completely back under American strategic command. And that, of course, was precisely what, for a long time, the blob hoped to avoid, which led to the decision for many years not to invade Ukraine. Thank you.
Exemplary. Wow. Under time. Okay, Hanna.
Thank you. It's an honor to join such distinguished speakers on this panel, and it's particularly nice to see Andrey again, who I've known for many years from Moscow. I wanted to make some overall remarks on this question of inevitability of the war. And Anatol, you've given this great sort of historical lead up to the invasion. I'll focus a little bit more on the immediate weeks and months leading up to the invasion to develop a slightly different argument for the sake of discussion. First of all, I mean, there is now, it seems to me, sort of powerful constituencies in the West that put forward this inevitability argument about this war, which says that Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was largely ideologically motivated, reflective of innate desire to restore some form of Russian empire, and that therefore no amount of negotiations with Russia on security guarantees in the time frame preceding the invasion could have averted this outcome. And those who make that argument point as evidence, for instance, to Putin's own interviews and essays, such as the text that he published in the summer of 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians to make this kind of argument. What this inevitabilist school concludes is also that Russia therefore had no real security grievances with the West, that all this grievance about NATO expansion was just a smokescreen for what were in fact ideological ambitions. Now, I have a lot of problems with that argument, to start with the fact that it essentializes Russia, absolves us as the West of any responsibility in getting us to a context in which war became possible. It also denies the fact that Putin's views on Ukraine, on Ukrainian nation, are perhaps not unequivocally shared among the broader Russian elite. But particularly, and here I agree with you, Anatol, this argument cannot at all account for the timing of when the war happened. If this was indeed predetermined, then why did Putin not make this decision in the 2014-2015 timeframe, when perhaps a full-scale invasion of Ukraine seemed more feasible from a Russian point of view? So I certainly come down on the side of contingency and the fact that this war was a consequence of interactions that Russia had both with the West and with Ukraine. So the contingency argument highlights Russia's dissatisfaction with aspects of the Minsk process, perhaps a conviction that set in 2021 that this process was not going to be implemented, grievance with the situation surrounding Medvedchuk and Ukraine, but perhaps also Putin's broader reading of the strategic picture. So I accept contingency, but I think an interesting question to answer is, well, at which point in the period leading up to February 2022 does war become inevitable in the sense of the path towards an alternative outcome substantially narrowing down? other options substantially narrowing down. And here, I mean, if we look at the year leading up to the invasion, what do we have? We have the Russian buildup starting from the spring of 2021. We have the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva in June of that year. We have the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. We have Bill Burns going to Moscow in November of 2021. And we then have Russia tabling demands for security guarantees in December. So I think the initial demands were formulated on December 7th, and then 10 days later, the Russian MFA actually put draft treaties in writing on the table. And then we have a back and forth with the United States and with Western countries. And so looking at the evidence of what transpired and what we know, and here, you know, I focus on the period leading up to the war, it would be my contention that chances to avert war had already substantially narrowed down by the point we get to this back and forth on security guarantees, given how Russia was carrying itself in the diplomacy that was happening at that time. There is an argument out there that the United States and NATO responded inadequately to the demands put forward by Russia at that time, and I'd like to push back against that notion. What did the Russians actually demand? They wanted long-term legal guarantees, which would exclude NATO's further advancement to the east. They wanted the decision taken at the Bucharest summit in 2008 to be disavowed. They wanted a legally binding agreement regarding US and other NATO countries' non-deployment of strike weapon systems threatening Russia on territories of adjacent countries. They wanted certain measures on military exercises to only happen at an agreed distance from the Russia-NATO contact line. I'm just going through the most important aspects here. They also called for a moratorium on the deployment of ground, short, and intermediate range missiles in Europe. Those are perhaps, and they also wanted a resumption of dialogue in the Russia-NATO format. Those are the things that Russia put on the table. Now, how did the United States react? The United States said, there are some things we're not going to discuss with Russia. NATO's open door policy and the contention that there would be a legal commitment to never include Ukraine and Georgia into NATO is not something the United States can discuss. Then the United States said, there are some things we will not discuss with you, Russia, bilaterally, because they belong in the format of the OSCE. They concern European countries. We will not have this conversation with you without Europe being at the table. But then there are things we can offer. And what the United States put on the table in that time frame was things like including discussing troop numbers, elements of force posture in NATO countries, regulations on military exercises. With relation to Ukraine, the Biden administration offered reciprocal transparency measures under which both sides would refrain from deploying offensive ground-launched missile systems and permanent forces on the territory of Ukraine. And there was also transparency measures offered to Russia to verify the absence of a Tomahawk cruise missile at the NATO bases in Romania and Bulgaria. So it was a mixed response. I would just like to point out that Russian experts in that time frame, January, February of 2021, including more hawkish voices in Moscow, were basically arguing, we got a lot. This is a victory for Russia. The United States is willing to discuss with us measures that it has not been willing to discuss for years. We should pocket those gains, call it a day, and move on. I mentioned to this group that I was myself in Moscow until February 23rd and discussing what was transpiring with members of the arms control expert community in Moscow. There was also a feeling that what Moscow was conducting was an exercise in coercive diplomacy, and it was getting gains, and this was what this was all about, and it was turning out beneficial for Russia. And regardless of that and what was being put on the table, and perhaps you could make the argument that if negotiations had continued, perhaps Russia could have gained even more, short of legal guarantees related to Ukraine's inclusion at some future point in NATO. There's also the argument, and Michael and I hosted Ambassador John Sullivan for a conversation about this a few months ago. John Sullivan served as the US ambassador to Russia in that time frame. And when he reflects on the back and forth of these security guarantees and the diplomacy that transpired, he very much had the feeling, and I quote him now, that the Russians were going through the motions. What do I mean by that? They were reading from their notes. There was no engagement. I'd raise questions, they'd look down and see where in their notes there was something possibly related to what I had asked. So a feeling that Russia was engaged in this diplomacy on the draft treaties and these security guarantees, but there was no real engagement, that by and large probably a decision, to go beyond that and opt for a military solution had already been decided upon. So that leads me then to conclude that if the diplomacy that transpired was not really serious, if Russia realized that it was not going to get legal guarantees on Ukraine's future non-membership in NATO, then the decision to go to war must have been taken sometime prior to that, in the perhaps 2021 timeframe, perhaps due to a mixture of disillusionment with the Zelensky government, combined with a reading of the geopolitical lay of the land that led Putin to believe that it was an opportune time to seek a different kind of solution to this problem. I'll end here. I just wanted to say I hope we can also reserve some part of the discussion later to where we go from here with Russia. But in terms of how we got to this point, let me end here.
Very nice. Thank you so much. Andrey.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm very grateful for an opportunity to be a part of this conversation and to see some of my old friends. And also, I love alternative history because it allows you to use your fantasy, not limiting it to facts or, conventional wisdom. But let me start with saying that I agree fully with what Hanna has already said, that we cannot discuss the war without putting it into a broader framework of the relations between Russia and the West. And I think that if we are thinking about alternative history, it is really very interesting to speculate about whether the current conflict between Russia and the West was inevitable. Can we imagine Russia today as let's say, a state similar to France? Not France of Emmanuel Macron, but rather France of General de Gaulle. France, which is a proud country, which has its own views on many important international issues. It's a country which dissents from the United States on many issues, which is not integrated into the NATO military structures, but at the same time who would deny the France of de Gaulle from being an organic part of the Western community of nations. And in my ideal world, I wrote about that back in the 1990s, that was exactly the role that Russia should seek for itself. The question is, why didn't it work out, despite so high expectations and hopes that Russia might become a true member of the Western community of nations? I don't want to get into detail, but I think that on the Russian side, we have to confess that there was a very clear manifestation of ignorance. And on the Western side, I would say it was a clear manifestation of arrogance. By ignorance, I mean that if I remember, 1990s, and there was a sincere intention to get closer to the West, but people in the Kremlin simply didn't know how to do that. And they were not ready, or they did not really realize that they had to invest a lot of political capital and to get a lot of expert knowledge in order to penetrate the Western system. I do recall working with the Kremlin, and let me just tell you that the EU section in the presidential administration had only 6 people working on the European Union in mid-1990s. It was headed by Sergei Yastrozhemsky at that point. And out of these 6 people, only 2 people were civilians. The rest, the 4, were generals. So that tells you about how the perception about joining the West was perceived in Moscow at that point. And of course, in the West, I think the perception was that Russia had no other way out. It was a country with very many problems, economic, social, demographic problems. It was a weakening country. So basically, as one of my friends told me at that point, I still remember that Russia is done. Now we have to deal with the Middle East. Russia was done in the sense that Russia had no other choice and no other path to go. And of course, that this perception didn't take into account the rise of China and many developments in Russia itself. So I think that if both sides had demonstrated more strategic vision and more imagination, probably we would have a very different type of relations between Moscow and Western capitals today, and probably the war wouldn't have happened. But now let me get to the Ukrainian issue and also to add my 5 cents to the conversation. And I'd like to make 2 points. The first point is about how inevitable was the drift of Ukraine away from Russia. I think that to some extent it was unavoidable, exactly because there is no clear red line between Russians and Ukrainians, and because I agree with what Dominique has said about the centrality of the Ukrainian issue in the Russian history. For Uzbeks or for Armenians, you don't need to argue that you are different from Russians. You know, culturally, historically, ethnically, these nations have their own very strong identities, especially if we take Armenia. But with Ukraine, it's different. And I think that the Ukrainian political establishment had to distance their country from Russia in order to somehow nail down their separate identity. That was unavoidable, but still it doesn't answer this question. Was this drift of Ukraine away from Russia so inevitable? And my take is that under a different set of circumstances, this relationship could have been not as dramatic and disruptive as they turned out to be. And the problem which I see on the Russian side over all these 30 years, but especially over the last 20 years, is that many leaders in Russia apparently did not appreciate and probably did not even comprehend the power of public politics. Be it in Russia, be it in Ukraine, be it in Kyrgyzstan, be it in any other country, including the United States and Western Europe. And the perception, which I think is still very common in the Russian leadership, is that if something happens, if something wrong is happening, be it on Bolotnaya or on Krещатик, it means that someone should have paid for it, someone from the outside should have organized it, someone should have conspired about it. And that's the only explanation which is perceived to be convincing. That's why if we look at the history of relations between Russia and Ukraine over the last 20 years, before the war, you'll see that there was major emphasis on backstage deals with Ukrainian oligarchs and with some political heavyweights at the expense of relations with the civil society, educational institutions, media, and so on and so forth. And I think that was a very serious mistake, because when they say that for 20 or 30 years, the West was trying to turn Ukraine into anti-Russia, even if we accept this narrative, who did prevent you from countering this strategy? You had such great positions in this country, including the Russian-speaking population, including history, including the geographical proximity. After all, Ukraine is closer to Russia than it is to the United States. So who did prevent you from having your counter game in Ukraine? Why you kept losing all the positions that you had there? And I think that can be explained only if we accept that there were some organic deficiencies to the Russian strategy regarding Ukraine. And the last point that I'd like to make is about possibilities to avoid a war during the last couple of years. And I think that there was an opportunity when Zelensky came to power. It was not a very, big window of opportunity, but I think that Zelensky had approximately half a year in order to change the momentum of the Russian-Ukrainian relationships and to come up to some kind of a settlement. We should remember that he came as a candidate of peace. He won because 70% of Ukrainians stood for peace, not for war. And there were some steps made in Moscow in order to meet him halfway. If you remember, it was the time when Surkov was replaced by Kozak, and we, I think, all know the difference between the two men, right? The anti-Ukrainian rhetoric was clearly decreased, and they started a couple of similarly productive consultations. There were a couple of rounds of negotiations, and what the Russian side should have done, in my view, it should have demonstrated more flexibility on the implementation of Minsk. If the Russian position was, look, we understand your limitations, we understand that your situation is very precarious, we understand that this window of opportunity will not last forever, so we would like to make you look great. We would like to support your position against your political opponents among the radical nationalists, and let us see what we can do. And again, I recall, we at our small think tank wrote tons of papers suggesting various ideas how we can meet Zelensky halfway. But the position taken by the Russian side was very formal. You signed it, you have to stick to it, and you have to stick to it in our interpretation of the Minsk II agreements. There was no flexibility, at least no major flexibility demonstrated by the Russian side during the first months of Zelensky rule. And then his agenda was overtaken by nationalists, and we could literally watch Zelensky shifting his positions on many important issues. So I think that that was an opportunity that was not used, and that made the war more likely than before. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tom.
Just a few points. First, I agree very much with Andrey that if the United States and Russia in particular had used much greater strategic imagination in the years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, we could have been in a much different place. It certainly wouldn't have been strategic partnership between our two countries because there are fundamental differences in the way we think about our own interest, global affairs, and so forth. But we could have developed a constructive, competitive relationship of some sort, which would have prevented many of the nasty things that have happened over the past 30 years. Second, I also agree with Andrey that there are a lot of things the Russians could have done after Zelensky was elected if they had been a bit more creative in their approach to Ukraine in creating a situation where war was not necessarily necessary to solve the problems. But what I really want to focus on is the last year before the war. So by the time we get to Biden's inauguration, we've already shown we didn't have any strategic imagination. The Russians have already, what's the appropriate word I'm looking for that's I can say, had lost the opportunity to calm the situation with Ukraine, to come to some sort of reasonable solution. And then ask ourselves, what was the dance about from the spring of 2021 to February 24th, 2022. So I think there are a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. First, I think it's quite clear that the Russian side wanted to be taken seriously by the Biden administration. And if you look at the initial rhetoric of the Biden administration, I think I talked about this yesterday, they made it very clear, one, that there was going to be no reset. That wasn't so much of a problem, but was the second thing that was a problem, I think, for the Kremlin in particular, is that Russia would not be a priority for the Biden administration. There were a few pragmatic things that they wanted to do with the Russians, where they thought our interest overlapped, or where there was a necessity of our two countries working together. But once they had done that, they wanted to park the relationship to the side so they could focus on what they thought was the major strategic challenge that we face going forward, and that's China. I think that was unacceptable to the Kremlin. You can't ignore Russia, and Russia has ways of bringing itself to the table, even if you don't want to talk to them. And to some extent, the military buildup in the spring, I think, in retrospect, was an effort to get the Americans' attention. And to a certain extent, it worked. Because of that buildup, Biden had a conversation with Putin. They agreed to a summit in Geneva in June, which was way in advance of the time frame that the Biden administration had for any meeting between Putin and the President of the United States. That summit had some positive aspects to it. Agreed to start working on strategic stability. We set up a working group on cyber problems. And actually there was some significant progress in all of those issues, in both of those issues, in the summer months going into the fall. But the one thing that was lacking was a sustained dialogue between the United States and Russia on the broader questions of European security. I think Ukraine is embedded in that broader context, and then you get the buildup in the fall. Again, I think to sort of force a discussion on European security. If you look at the bilateral treaties that were released in the middle of December in 2021 on security guarantees, what I find interesting is Ukraine hardly figures in those documents. I think it's mentioned in one. I forget which one, whether it's the bilateral with the United States or the bilateral one with NATO. But the key demands all focused on European security. Hanna has laid out some of them. I have a slightly different take on that. I think the three that Putin continually mentioned in public were no NATO expansion, the strike weapons, I think is right. But the third was the withdrawal of NATO infrastructure back to the lines of 1997. At the time, the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act before the first wave of NATO expansion. Now, some of those things were non-starters from the standpoint of the United States. I think the Russian side realized that. The question, I think, when we get to December, is whether it was possible to structure a dialogue, a negotiation that would have been sufficiently attractive to the Kremlin to continue over several months into the future. Now, I think we need to recognize that the Kremlin is operating under some time pressure at that point because they had hundreds of thousands of troops in the field. And as the military experts kept telling us, when you have that many troops in the field, you either have to use them or you bring them home, back to their home bases. If you bring them back to the home bases, you've lost the coercive element, but you just can't keep them hanging around in the field. So they have to actually go into action. So we're working on a fairly tight time span to persuade the Kremlin that that we were prepared to engage in serious negotiations or to discover whether the Kremlin was prepared to engage in serious negotiations. I think two things had the potential to change the situation. One is that we had to have strictly confidential negotiations. The Russians, I think, made a big mistake. Perhaps it was deliberate in publishing the documents and making this a public discussion, a public negotiation. We continued that into January. I think the formats for all of this were inappropriate if the idea is to get to a resolution of a problem. We had a short discussion between the United States and Russia. We then moved it to a broader discussion with NATO, and then a final discussion with the OSCE. The U.S. position was clearly at that point, no conversations about Ukraine without Ukraine in the room, no conversations about Europe without Europeans in the room. That is a recipe for no resolution of these problems. The only place where you had a chance for serious discussions was with the United States and Russia. The United States clearly with the obligation to have full consultations with its allies, full consultations with the Ukrainians before it went into those discussions. But once you make the negotiating format the entire NATO alliance with Russia, what you're getting is talking points, not a serious discussion of what the ways out of the problem are. If you do the OSCE, even more so. You have 50 countries in the room. There's no negotiation with 50 countries in the room. There is a presentation of talking points. So what the United States and Russia needed to do was to set up a separate private channel, and it needed to be non-public. If you wanted to get to a solution of this problem, you couldn't have this done in the glare of the press, so that every meeting, people have to step out and say what they've accomplished, where things are moving, this, that, and the other thing. That, again, is not the way you do serious diplomacy. Now, to my knowledge, there was no effort to do any serious, it's not back channel because it's still government talking to governments, but to reach out, to set up some sort of serious channel between the White House and the Kremlin, where these very sensitive issues could have been discussed, and we could have found whether there was sufficient flexibility on both sides to reach towards some solution. The second issue where I think the United States made a mistake is that we should have been prepared to put everything on the table. We were not going to come to a meeting of minds on NATO expansion, but we should have at least said we're prepared to talk about it. When it comes to Ukraine, I think there were creative ways of dealing with the Ukrainian problem at that point. I mean, I had publicly proposed a moratorium on Ukrainian membership in NATO, based in part on a conversation where I had a senior Kremlin official, where I came to the conclusion that a moratorium would have been acceptable if we could have found the appropriate number of years to hold it, right? The Kremlin was clearly satisfied with a 100-year moratorium. They would have satisfied with a 50-year moratorium. The question was, could we have offered something, try splitting it in half, 25 years of work. But there was a serious conversation to be had, and we weren't prepared to put that on the table in a serious way. So I think that would have changed the nature of the conversation, perhaps open up the possibility for further discussion. One final point is that we still had the issue of the Donbass and the Crimea that we had to resolve. I think there were creative ways of approaching that as well. The proposal that I floated along with a Russian colleague of mine was to put the question of where these regions wanted to belong to a referendum. Democratic principle, actually building on something that Dominic said this morning, the question is about the formation of the Russian nation and the Ukrainian nation. Well, let the people decide themselves whether they want to be part of the Russian nation or part of the Ukrainian nation. We could have done that with a referendum, and we could have done it in such a way that we would have set a precedent not only for the resolution of these problems in Ukraine, but a way of approaching all the other frozen conflicts in Europe. So, short summation, I think with a greater deal of creativity, a little courage on the political side, we could have put ourselves in a position where war was not the answer to the problem, and we could have opened up a diplomatic track that would have been difficult, but certainly would have been better than what we have right now.
Just to say, I think this is an absolutely fascinating panel, because we all came at it from different angles, but actually none of these angles were incompatible as far as I can see. They all contributed to the general picture. I mean, if I'd had more time, I would have stressed Ukrainian internal politics and Russia's and Zelensky's failure. That's a critical point. The only, and also a very unpopular subject in academia today. But I think, what came out particularly from your remarks, Tom, was that diplomatic history really matters. Diplomacy, skillful diplomacy, matters. And
but for that you need diplomats.
well, but we've just heard from two speakers about just how miserably incompetent both, I mean, the American and the Russian sides in their different ways were. I mean, I think on the also when it came to dealing with the European Union, there was a kind of structural problem summed up, Kissinger's famous remarks about, who do I call in the European Union, and the Russians, being obsessed with talking to powerful people. They were just completely bewildered and frustrated by the setup of the European Union. I mean, just to go back a little bit, I also shared this dream of Russia becoming de Gaulle's France. But I think that you do have to recognize in that context everything that, Chai has been talking about and I've been talking about. Russia is a land empire. This wasn't just, under de Gaulle, the loss of Algeria. It's as if they'd also lost Brittany and Alsace-Lorraine, and that, these were now being turned into members of a, and at that point, I think de Gaulle wouldn't have been de Gaulle, or he wouldn't have lasted as de Gaulle. I think we've probably got, the military coup against him would have succeeded. And, well, now we're into real alternative history. But the point about this going much more, the decolonization, going right into the heart of what Frenchmen had thought of as France or Russians had thought of as Russia, made it a significantly different problem.
I'm not going to propose that the United States is any kind of evil empire, but there is a view in Russia, a discourse, and Putin himself has expressed it, that there were people in the West who dreamed about, in some sense, pushing Russia into Asia, or by removing Ukraine and making it a Western satellite in some sense, Russia would be reduced to a second-rate power for generations, if not forever. And I wonder if there's anything to that within some circles in influential places in the United States.
That's a question for Andrey to answer.
Or Hanna.
I mean, I'll just quickly say that argument has never convinced me, because what you do with that is drive Russia into the arms of China, which, if you're sitting in Washington, is precisely the outcome that you want to avoid. So it doesn't convince me.
I would give a slightly different answer. Part of the problem is, if you look at American administrations for the past 30 years, quite frankly, we didn't care whether Russia was in China's embrace or not. I think the problem, or one of the problems that we've had for the past 30 years, is there's never been any deep respect for Russian power. If you talk to people in Washington about the China challenge and about the strategic alignment between Russia and China, the conclusion you come to is that from the standpoint of Washington, the Russia plus China is not sufficiently greater than the challenge that the United States faces from China alone, that you're going to be prepared to make any concessions to Russia in order to prevent that alignment from happening. There's nothing that any concession that you would make that would put you in a better position than where you are without making that. So it was a losing proposition. Turning Russia into a second-rate power, in many ways that was the strategy from the very beginning, if it's not said, if we didn't say that quite clearly in public.
Andrey, did you want to get on that one?
Well, just, very, very briefly, there is a notorious statement by Zbigniew Brzezinski on Russia and Ukraine, and he argues that with Ukraine, Russia would always remain an imperial power and a disruptive force in the international system. Without Ukraine, Russia might become a normal nation state. Therefore, it is in the U.S. interest to make sure that Russia and Ukraine, drift away from each other. And there are many comments in Russian academia to this statement. On the one hand, I recall a lot of articles arguing that Ukraine is not an asset but a liability, that Ukraine has always been a basket case, we have to subsidize it, it brings no value added to the Russian might, and therefore Brzezinski is wrong, and Russia can be an imperial structure without Ukraine, maybe stronger than otherwise. But in the end, usually all these comments end with a note that still, we need to get Ukraine back, though there is little logic in this conclusion. But de facto, they agree with Brzezinski that Ukraine is an organic component to Russia as an imperial state.